Good evening. I am Randy Williams, Presidential Fellow and Special Assistant to the President and Dean of Multicultural Affairs. Welcome to tonight's forum entitled Lessons Within Ferguson, Missouri. Your presence tonight is an implication of the interest that you have in learning more from our various campus members about the shooting death of Michael Brown and the constructs that are related to this case. I can think of no more appropriate setting than a university campus to have a discussion, a civil discussion, on complex issues that plague our society. And I'm extremely proud that the Elon community exercised this benefit. Recognizing a shared focus, the Council for Civic Engagement and the Multicultural Center collaborated quickly, I may add, to co-sponsor this forum tonight. You will hear from a panel of faculty who are experts in their fields and disciplines. You will also have the opportunity to chime in on the discussion and ask questions. Dr. Naima Clark, Associate Professor of Communication, will moderate the forum after introducing the panelists. But before we get to the panel discussion, Dr. Jason Husser, the Faculty Fellow for Civic Engagement and Assistant Professor of Political Science and Policy Studies, will provide some brief comments about the purpose and parameters of our civil dialogue this evening. Following, Student Government Association President Joe Corvia and student and Ferguson, Missouri resident Mia Watkins will make statements. Dr. Husser, please come to the podium.
When I was standing up here taking a panorama photo, something became very clear to me, and that is that Elon University is committed to inclusive dialogue about major issues impacting our institution. And we hear that word institution a lot, but it's really critical. We're not just individuals or members of a subpopulation. Together, we're embodying here one of history's greatest developments, and that's a university, a focal point for the meetings of minds. If we can't have these types of conversations here, they don't happen anywhere. So no crisis of importance like this is one group's experience alone. No group should have to carry those issues alone. Situations like Ferguson don't just affect one population. Their causes are rooted into social phenomena we share more broadly. Civic problems like those underlying Ferguson are not just African American problems, they're not just white problems, they are human problems, problems we must all tackle together. Now that all sounds good, but in pragmatic reality, it's important to remember that these issues aren't easy. If solutions were simple and low-hanging fruit were easily available, the problems would have already been solved and the fruit would have already been picked. Issues with the potential to be divisive, like this, always share one thing in common. They are inherently difficult. Dialogue about change can represent legitimate threat to many stakeholders. However, we simply must try. Systems of equilibrium produce suboptimal returns when actors in those systems fail to utilize all information available to them. As individuals, workable answers are often higher than our individual grasp. But as a community, we can build structures to reach heights otherwise impossible on our own, places where collective solutions exist. And that's why I thank each of you for being here tonight.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of the Student Government Association of Elon, I would like to commend the community for their efforts to bring awareness and education surrounding the events that occurred in Ferguson, Missouri. This incident has sparked discussion around larger social issues in our country. One of the goals of SGA is to create a unified community and support all students in their quest to be active, engaged community members and global citizens. While we are students, we talk about being global citizens and understanding differences, while being in tune with the world around us through opportunities for civil dialogue and understanding. When events happen around our country that polarize groups and provoke discussion, it is our responsibility to take the opportunity to learn from these situations and understand the history, culture, and societal implications surrounding them. SGA does not stand for or tolerate social injustices of any type, whether it be racism, excessive force, profiling, or anything else. Our goal is to create a community where all members feel safe and comfortable and are able to thrive in an environment where they belong. In order to have a successful academic environment, we need to band together as a university to create this community and to engage in civil dialogue. For this reason, I think it is incredibly important for us to take advantage of our ability to learn about Ferguson and how we are all affected by the death of Michael Brown. I think it is great to have so many students here at Elon that want to learn about and discuss this event, and it shows the initiative that many of you have. I am incredibly proud that we are able to come together as a community to show support and provide an educational impact as well. I hope that we are all able to come away tonight with more perspective of what's going on and happening in Missouri, how it affects our community and society, and an understanding of what we as students, citizens, and community members can do to create a welcoming environment for us all. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Mia Janae Watkins. I'm a junior here at Elon University, and I'm going to share a statement with you all, so thank you all for being here tonight. I have lived in Ferguson, Missouri my entire life. I remember taking 5-minute trips with my parents down to the Quick Trip that no longer stands, filling the car with gas, and filling our mouths with snacks. We've never encountered problems with the police, who I didn't fear growing up. The shops viewed on the news have been stores that I've seen since I was a little girl. Not much has changed visually in my neighborhood until a few weeks ago. There is a known sense of socioeconomic racism in St. Louis. Growing up, I was made aware of it, but I've never seen the issue erupt in such a calamity such as this. On Sunday, August 10th, my mother and I are shocked to receive phone calls about the riots that occurred, and we didn't know what our loved ones meant until we got home. My house is located in a semi-suburban residential area. Behind my backyard is the main street where the riots took place. It was anxious to see my family, to hear helicopters circling our neighborhood, seeing people walking up and down the street, looting the local stores that have been good to the community, and to see our backyard in the local news. Soon our backyard will be in the national news. In my opinion, the media portrayal of Ferguson has become muddled with outside information, outside incidents, and campaigns that have spread all over the U.S. that, while they are powerful tools that motivate the story, make it difficult to see how much Ferguson is hurting. My heart breaks for those afraid to go out at night. My heart breaks for the children of the Ferguson neighborhood who have been affected by these events. My heart breaks for those who are doing good in the community, but the negativity of the news overpowers them. My heart breaks for seeing my neighborhood being torn to pieces and feeling extremely uneasy as the world takes these pieces of Ferguson into their own hands. Lines have been crossed, lines not unfamiliar to us: ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic status. Lines that we strive to connect with but are broken when the connection has been misunderstood or neglected. While I experienced a warm, safe Ferguson, there were other Ferguson residents who are not having that same experience. What effect does Ferguson have on Elon, to the Elon community? What can we do to make sure we don't reach that breaking point? Yes, we have slogans that say that we belong, but what can we do to make sure that everyone feels that way? It took one horrible incident in Ferguson to show a totally different picture than what I've described tonight. So let us work together to make sure that whatever that one incident is, whatever lies beneath the surface here, doesn't disrupt the inclusive environment that we are working so hard to create. Thank you.
Mia, will you teach my class tomorrow? You do anything at 10:30? Hi, I'm Naima Clark. I'm an associate professor in the School of Communications, and I teach entertainment studies. And so when I was asked to come and moderate this panel, I was excited because I can talk about Scandal all day, but I think Those of you who have me know I can do that. But today I really want to talk about something a little bit more meaningful, and so I'm really excited to be here. Let me introduce our panelists, and I've got an opening question for them, and I encourage you, all of you, to ask some questions of your own. I think we're here for a discussion, not just to be talked at. So first, I'd like to introduce Jim Bissett. He's been at Elon for a long time, 24 years. He is a social historian, and he's especially interested in U.S. social movements, and he is finishing up a research project on school desegregation here in Alamance County. Ken Fernandez is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Policy Studies and is the director of the Elon Poll. His research interests include public opinion and public policy in the areas of crime, immigration, education, and local economic development. India Johnson is an assistant professor in psychology who earned her PhD at The Ohio State University. Dr. Johnson's work examines factors that contribute to social inequality. Her most recent work has examined factors that contribute to social change, as well as the antecedent and consequences of prejudicial evaluations. Robert Parrish is an assistant professor in the School of Law, Elon School of Law. In addition to his legal work, Parrish also has experience as an oral historian and archivist, having worked for the Center of Documentary Studies Behind the Veil Project, which produced Remembering Jim Crow, a compilation of interviews with African Americans born between 1900 and 1940. And last but not least, Sandra Reed is a professor in Health and Human Services. She has a master's degree in counseling from North Carolina Central. Upon graduating, she worked for the Department of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention for more than 20 years. And while working at the department, she was a chief court counselor. So I'm sure you will agree this is a perfect panel to have to start this discussion on campus. So I've got a question for the panelists. And again, audience, please feel free to ask questions of your own. Don't make me do all the work. It seems that incidents such as what happened in Ferguson happen a lot. You know, there's Trayvon Martin, there's Renisha. There are stories in the news frequently. Why has this story become such a lightning rod for America?
I think it has to do with the riots. This happens a lot. You had in 2009 the Fruitvale BART incident, right, which was clearly just an atrocity, and there were protests, but they were peaceful, and I think that has galvanized the national attention on this community, and it creates this question that sort of I'm wrestling with: what role does protest and even sort of going beyond civil disobedience play in trying to push for social change?
Are the riots becoming almost, it's what's drawing the media's attention, and so is there good that can come from rioting?
I wrestle with that. I would argue for this case, I think the answer is clearly no, and the reason why I would say that is I think the goal is to reform police behavior. And so I think the average resident, citizen, voter looks at the protests and says, what a shame that the unarmed teenager was shot. But I'm sure glad the police are there to sort of keep control of the riot. And in the back of their mind, they're sort of relieved that the police are there. And that's not, I don't think that's what the protesters want. So I think it actually is counterproductive.
I see there's a question in the crowd. If you want to stand up, there's a microphone, and Dr. Book is grabbing the mic. Awesome.
So with that being said, you said that you don't think riot would create change, but with them rioting for a week, they finally got the officer's name. Do you think that the officer's name would have been released without rioting?
Yes, it would have. Generally, these are very slow procedures in that the information will be leaked out quite slowly, and that is pretty typical. Eventually, the information would be released.
Eventually, how long do you think it would have taken if people weren't rioting?
That's a good question. No, I actually think protests, right, can push people to action. But I think in the long run, if we want to change attitudes and policy change, I think the violent protests will actually be counterproductive. But again, I've wrestled with this. I think there was a great book written in the 1980s, Protest is Not Enough, right? So you have to vote. But I honestly believe that voting is sometimes not enough, right? That you actually have to go out and engage in civil disobedience to get attention. But I think the violent protest can be counterproductive.
Dr. Bissett, could you put sort of America's civil rights history is full of protest, nonviolent protest. How does this sort of jibe with what Professor Fernandez is talking about?
For me, the brilliance of the civil rights movement was that they understood that, as you put it, for social change to happen, we have to force the people who are standing in our way to change. Social injustice occurs or lives because the people who are committing that injustice benefit from it. And so civil rights activists understood that marching wasn't enough. Marching was important, and marching is important, and it helps to build sort of a community and a psychological sense of worth. But if you think about the civil rights movement, in Birmingham, for example, they didn't just march. They were marching downtown to boycott stores. Or in Selma, they were marching to the courthouse to register to vote. So you're taking direct positive action in order to force your opponents to change. And that's really the brilliance of the civil rights movement. That hasn't happened yet in Ferguson. It may happen, but it hasn't yet. And I should also say that American history, certainly 20th century American history, is rife with examples of looting and violence like is going on in Ferguson. I mean, between 1965 and 68, there were 3,000 riots like this in cities across the United States. Mm-hmm. So it's not a new phenomenon, and certainly is a result of the same kinds of causes.
Well, also what we see even in nonviolent protests is that there's always this issue of provocation. So in civil disobedience, we have an act seeking to provoke the powers that be to have some reaction to engage with the protesters. And that's not quite the analog we see in Ferguson, but we see even in the rioting, there's some provocation that's taking place still with the system.
Okay. Did you have a question?
Yes, to the panelist who first spoke, the man second to the right. Yes, sir. In your opinion, what was it that caused, because when this first started, when Michael Brown was first shot, they were not riots, they were merely peaceful protests from what we've gained so far from any type of outlet, but they were peaceful protests at one time. It was still sprinkled in with looters, which is what the media tended to focus on. But what do you think tipped Ferguson, the residents of Ferguson, to go from peaceful protesting to full-out rioting?
That is a great question. I don't know if I have the correct answer. I think I had a colleague at UC Riverside that studied social movements and looked at World Trade Organization protests and World Bank, and he concluded that they do sort of draw some small element that sees the ability to be sort of anonymous in these crowds and allows them to engage. Even though 99% of the people want peaceful protest, that 1% can sort of tip the balance. Again, you can also maybe perhaps blame the militarization of the police, where once you have that visualization of that armament, right, that armor, it really sort of has a physical and mental change on your attitude. So I think there's a lot of different combinations. It's a great question. I don't think I have the
And maybe
perfect
not just
answer.
the militarization of the police, but their overreaction.
Yeah.
So you said the police's overreaction or the residents'
The
overreaction?
police overreaction.
Yeah, because it was hard to tell, because when about a week in, once it happened, it was, you would turn on Fox News, which is also not a very credible source, but you would turn that on, and you would hear them, blaming the residents. I mean, there was nothing but just racial comments about the percentage of African Americans, and somehow that correlates to riots, which I don't see how that makes any sense. But they would say something about that, and then you would flip the channel to something probably a little bit more credible, still not as credible, and they would say something about the militarization of the police force, and they would try to compare that to some of the weapons that we had in Afghanistan, and it's just, it was hard to really tell where the breaking point was and who that falls upon. And that was kind of my question towards you, what you thought about it. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, and also, watching the news coverage, it seems that many of the rioters, many of the looters were not from Ferguson. They're people who have flown down. So what sort of is the mentality of that group who is almost organized to create havoc?
I think that just kind of comes down to the fact that it created a situation where it was an easy opportunity. You know, so my two daughters are here, and a few of you guys might have seen them. And I was telling them the other day, like, I feel like a lot of crimes are the result of it's an easy opportunity. And so I think people were just exploiting the situation that was going on, and they recognized that this is an opportunity for them to go and loot and kind of create havoc. And so they did just that, and it wasn't really tied to any of the events that happened in Ferguson.
I should say, I don't really know how many people were from outside, how many people were from Ferguson. But as a historian, I'm always suspicious when I hear about outside agitators, because that was the cliche during the Civil Rights Movement. It was these outside agitators. In fact, Governor Pat McCrory said it about the Memorial Monday protests. And it's a comfortable thing to say for a couple of reasons. First of all, it delegitimizes the protest. But I think maybe more importantly, it allows you to think that things aren't so bad. We don't really have a problem in Ferguson. Things aren't that bad. It's the outsiders who are causing. So that's really a dangerous kind of situation to put yourself in.
Tony?
Can you hear me? Earlier there was a question about the release of the police officer's name, and my question for the entire panel, but I guess the professor from the School of Law would be able to shed some light on it as well. When the name of the police officer was released, it was also bundled with information that Brown was suspected of robbing a convenience store prior to being shot. So as far as character assassination and saying, here's the name of the person who did it, but we also suspect that prior to this happening, he was involved in some questionable behavior. Do you think that was coincidental, or do you think that that was calculated? And if so, why?
I mean, it's not a strict legal issue. So what we're dealing with is a media issue. We're dealing with the court of public opinion. So we had people on both sides coalescing. The gentleman who spoke earlier was talking about the Fox News coverage and the tint of that coverage attempting to portray African Americans in a certain light. It's the same tactic. So police action is justified given who this young man was or appeared to be, given the circumstances we can dig up about his background and past. In terms of a legal consequence, it has no legal bearing whatsoever, but it is very important in terms of telling a narrative and telling a story. And it appears that the police wanted to tell a certain narrative to cover its backside, so to speak, and they thought that would help. And in some respects, it did.
I do think, though, that this question raises a point about the media martyring Michael Brown. Michael Brown was not a perfect person. But the media initially, he was going to college, he was a great kid. Well, he had done maybe something wrong. And I think that telling that story is actually extremely powerful, because the police deal with imperfect people, not the perfect people every single day. And so how do they behave when there is someone who is imperfect? And I think to not tell that part of the story does not tell the truth about actually what the police behavior is on a daily basis. I know, I just took a platform there. I'm sorry.
Can I
Please, yes.
I'd just like to say something about that. When this all happened, and the fact that we think about people, the way we value people's lives, so it was okay when we thought, or it seemed to be, this is a tragedy because this young man maybe hadn't been in trouble, he was on his way to college, and then we start this other narrative about, he possibly was the person that committed some offense. And in human services and dealing with our students, I mean, we've got to really think about all people have value. It does not matter. It doesn't matter if he stole something or not. He's still a human being, and there's value to that. And we have a tendency as a society to look at, what a person has obtained in their life, what they have, all these superficial things. But at the end of the day, he's a person, And so is that police officer as well. And I think we have to be careful not to move away from, human beings and how we place value on people's lives.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
You had a question?
I'm Colin Rackley, class of '98. I'm almost married a young lady of Puerto Rican descent, and I know of one other white male graduate of Elon who is married outside of his race. For me, when my people I thought were my friends from Elon, I found out they really weren't my friends. And I found out I've seen how dangerous it really can be. You can see I'm having a hard time talking about it. And I think part of it starts with life being devalued in the first place. You were just talking about, I've had black or Latino coworkers in the hotel business. I'll see their names in the paper. A couple of them have been murdered, and they were my friends. And both times, it got a little bit of media coverage, a few paragraphs in the back of the paper. Whereas it's like, oh, it's just another dead thug. It's okay for bad things to happen to them or something, Whereas when something like Newtown happened, innocent little angels. Oh, they're innocent because they're white.
So I think your comment brings me to another question about sort of the Elon community. Those of us who live here, what is the sort of the state of race relations in this community? Do you feel, for all the panelists who live in Elon, Burlington, do you feel that an incident like that could happen here? Not everyone at once.
Well, I don't live here, but I think it can happen anywhere. I think we have two competing concerns in this country legally when it comes to these kinds of incidents. We have, on the one hand, all of our Fourth Amendment rights to be free from police interference, from the police searching and seizing our homes or going in our homes without warrants. But we also have this notion that we want the police to have some sense of security when they go about their business. So we have this concept in the law called reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal wrongdoing, and it gives the police the right to detain you, search you if they feel as if you are potentially threatening or they think you may have a weapon. The problem is in Elon, Greensboro, Durham, New York City, Chicago, that reasonable articulable suspicion has now become a proxy for skin color. So just by virtue of me being black, it gives the police a heightened sense of threat, and they can search me, or if they feel threatened enough, they can shoot me, kill me. In terms of what race relations are here in Burlington or Elon, I think it's relatively the same everywhere. It's the same kinds of concerns permeate our culture and our society right now.
And we currently have a federal lawsuit going on in Alamance County, a lawsuit against the Alamance sheriff in regards to racial profiling of Latinos. And so, and that is something that's been documented in numerous communities. And when you target a population, that creates tension, and that creates, possibility for violence.
We actually are lucky enough to have the Chief of Police of Elon here, Dennis Franks, and I've got a question, and I'm going to go out on a limb here. I think that what this discussion is raising is that there is, unfortunately, a systemic suspicion of people of color. How do police officers put that suspicion aside, something that is just ingrained since we've grown up to be fearful of other people? How do police officers put that aside to do their jobs and serve communities? That's an easy question.
Dennis Franklin, Chief of the University Police. Cliff Parker is the Chief of the town. He's sitting right here. It is a tough question, but I look at it as the police are here to serve. We talk about service. When I got here, we revamped our mission statement. I told people that I talked to about it, that I told my officers, I go, if you want to take two things out of our mission statement, is that we are a service-oriented agency and that we treat all people with dignity and respect. And I said, if those are the only two things you pull out of this mission statement that fits up this whole board in the hallway of our police department, you'll be successful in building relationships with your community, but you'll also be successful as a police officer. I don't know how well that answers your question, but I mean, I firmly stand behind that. Service is how we build relationships and how we develop partnerships.
Is there training for dealing with, bias? Is there training for dealing, even in a case like this where, hands were up, shoot? What is the training for the police officers in these situations?
The state mandates 24 hours of training every year, and it varies throughout the year. And there is some, I think last year, if I'm wrong, it was juvenile sensitivity training was one of the titles. Something we've done just recently is I've got 3 officers who have been through the Anti-Defamation League Train the Trainer. All the officers go through the Campus of Change or Campus of Difference. We've just set up some training with Matthew Antonio Bosch, with the director of the LGBTQIA, and Randy Williams and I just talked the other day, and we're going to get ready to set up some in-service training just where they come in and talk at our roll calls or our shift briefs for 20 or 30 minutes and just continually do that so we can, again, it's under my impression is that that's how we develop our relationships, so that's how we get to know our community that we serve.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I saw a question on the stage. A hand went up on the stage. No? Oh, okay, your question's over. Here in the audience.
Just looking at this as a case study, do we want to see change in how we as a society see racial profiling, or do we want to see change in the protections the law grants police officers?
I guess I can take that one. I mean, it's a tough balance, and that's the point. These are questions that we as a society have to decide. So there is no easy answer to that question because they're both important concerns, right? We need the police to feel safe and secure as they go about their job, but we also have, and I don't even think it boils down, we can take race out of it in some respects. It's all of us. How safe and secure should we feel from police interference in our daily lives? So we have to strike a balance somewhere. The Supreme Court has attempted to do that at times. It seems as if the law is now going in the other, it's a bit of a pendulum, right? So it's gone farther towards police protection in recent years, where we see cases like in New York City, where they had the stop and frisk law that was deemed unconstitutional. So we always are pushing back and forth. So there's no easy solution to it. We're still working on it as a society legally. And at some point, maybe we'll get to a nice balance. We just haven't figured it out yet. And race happens to be one of those components of that question, but I think it's much bigger than that in some ways.
Does the police, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Dr. Husser had mentioned that there are no easy, answers. There's no low-hanging fruit, but maybe the lowest hanging fruit would be hiring more African-American officers. Having 4 out of 53 officers being African-American, whatever your attitudes on affirmative action, I think that is just obviously a formula for tension and problems. There is evidence that even minority officers do engage in racial profiling, but I think it would go a long way for community relations with the police.
I really want to piggyback on his point because one of the things I always talk about in class is there is some really specific research that looks at the likelihood of shooting an unarmed versus armed black or white man. They actually created a video game where they have college students like you all, and they're seeing different backgrounds, and then a suspect appears. They're either black or they're white, and they're either armed or they're unarmed. And if you've had me in class, you know that I've talked about this study. And all they have to do is to make a decision whether to shoot or not shoot. okay? And they have to do this really quickly, like in 15 milliseconds, okay? And what's really interesting about this research is that they've done it with white participants, and they've also done it with black participants. And it doesn't matter whether the participants are white or whether participants are black, you are more likely to shoot if they are black and unarmed. That's where they're making the errors, okay? So what does that tell us, okay? That tells us that it's about the stereotype. It's about the association between black and criminal. And so when you have to make a split-second decision, you use any cue that's available to help you make that decision a little faster, okay? And so while I do definitely agree that there needs to be more African American and Black American police officers, I think some of that high-hanging fruit, so to speak, is to talk about how blacks are represented in lots of different forms. You know, you talk about the media and whether or not that is intentional. Remember during Hurricane Katrina, there was the news stories of African Americans looting while white Americans were finding food. Hold someone accountable. You know, it's Hurricane Katrina, everyone's just trying to survive, right? But hold someone accountable. Think about how individuals are represented, okay? So I think kind of thinking about how we can change that stereotype, which is really, really hard to do because we're exposed to those stereotypes from an early age, is also critical in trying to make sure that we can unpack situations like this.
How do we begin? What's the first step to unpacking systemic stereotyping?
I think the first is kind of just the fact that we're all here and we acknowledge that we're biased, okay? So I tell my students all the time, everyone is biased. It does not matter if you swear up and down that you're not, you know, you are biased, and these type of judgments matter. You don't have to believe a stereotype for it to influence your judgment, okay? And so kind of thinking about the ways in which you're biased and acknowledging that bias, and there's research that illustrates this, is kind of the first step to trying to getting people to change their attitudes and even the types of interactions they have with people who are of a different racial background. Yeah.
I see a question here.
Just off what you just said about the stereotypes of black people as criminals and white people are not, where do you think that it's rooted in? Because recently, like, the media especially, I feel like you see media portrayals of white criminals, the Boston bomber, for example, being on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine looking like a rock star, whereas you see, like, black criminals being just kind of like, that's what they are, and just assume. So do you think, first question, where do you think the stereotyping came from, or like where in history that kind of think that the media portrays that?
It's a hard question.
That's a hard question. I mean, I can give a half answer to that, perhaps. I had a student last year who wrote a paper about media images of African Americans in television news, and she did a study where she cited calculations of how much time black suspects were shown on local newscasts versus white suspects, and in what context. And with black suspects, it was always a mugshot. It was always them looking their worst, seeing how tall they were, being portrayed as a criminal, essentially. So, but for their white counterparts who had committed roughly the same crimes, they would find some stock photo from their family rather than the mugshot. So it portrays this image that black is criminal routinely, whereas we have a more nuanced or more softened view of a white suspect in the same situation. So these images have been perpetuated. I can't give you an exact date, like 1955 was the start of this. But my guess would be roughly when we have the up-ramp of the war on drugs and we see lots of criminal prosecutions of blacks and the violence associated with that. We see these people on the local news on a regular basis. That starts changing people's perceptions about and we saw there is some data, there's some social science data that shows that those perceptions did change around the late 1970s, early 1980s when the war on drugs was beginning to ramp up. I don't think we can pinpoint that.
I'm a historian, so I like to go back even further. And I would suggest, starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, white Southern politicians routinely portrayed black men as menacing beasts who wanted to rape white women. Mm-hmm. And they did that because there was a political payoff for making that argument, because then they could portray themselves as part of the Southern Democratic Party as protecting white women. And we've all read To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Lynchings, because this idea that black men are menacing and want to do harm to white women. Let me just give you one other example. of how this continues. In 2010, there was a campaign here in Alamance County for state senate. The incumbent was a black man. I received in my mailbox a mailing from his opponent, and it had a picture of a menacing black criminal on it who was a rapist, and saying that his opponent, the incumbent, wanted to let this man free. And so it was the use of the fear of the black man for political gain, and it worked. The incumbent lost, let's just put it that way. We can't say it was simply for that reason. But so the cultural legacy of segregation and racism and racial fear that's been inculcated remains with us, I would suggest.
The famous photo of O.J. Simpson that was purposely doctored.
Or the Willie Lee Horton ads in 1988.
Calling him Willie rather than his actual name that he was called was William.
Hi, we touched on this very briefly, but from a political science perspective strictly, what is the role of the national government in this incident? And is our government doing its job appropriately? And then from an historical perspective, what's been the history of the way our government has approached similar incidences in the past?
I think our expectation of the federal government is to make sure that there's a thorough investigation and that full information is covered. And I don't think we have full information regarding all the things that have happened. If I was a leader in the town of Ferguson or a resident, I would demand the federal government fund body cameras for every police officer. I think that people are on camera, whether you're being pulled over or the police officer, you're going to more likely behave appropriately if you know that you're being videotaped. And I would demand, I'm sure that the police couldn't afford that right now. I would demand the federal government provide grants rather than militarizing the police, providing things that ensure the protection of police officers and the residents. I don't know if that's an accurate answer, but that's my personal feeling.
Hello. Just going back to what Dr. Fernandez was saying before about Latinos and racial profiling in this same county, I think it's becoming very obvious that Latinos are becoming the new minority that is being systemically discriminated against in this country as well, as far as the Show Me Your Papers laws and even just like the language surrounding especially undocumented Hispanics, calling them illegal instead of undocumented, for example. So just as both groups being people of color in this country, I just wanted to know what you guys thought about how both of these groups, as well as other minorities and even just other communities in this country, coming together to create solidarity, and if you think, what are the steps to, first of all, doing that, and the lasting effect that could have?
Are there similarities in the struggle where there can be a meeting of the minds?
Yeah, it's tough. You know, I'm not an expert on social movements. One of my favorite professors when I was an undergraduate, and one of the reasons I became a political science professor, Steve Erie, still teaching at UC San Diego, he did not have a very optimistic view of the Rainbow Coalition, unfortunately. He thought that it was difficult to bring Latinos and Asians and African Americans together, partly because of segregation, partly because of perceived notion of fighting over the sort of small, similar piece of pie that was sort of thrown to them by the sort of the majority. So I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but it's a great question.
We should say that social change is very, very difficult to bring about because societies, like human beings, most primal instinct is to live, self-preservation. Right. Same thing is true of societies. And societies that are healthy have institutions that work to preserve the status quo, which means they have a huge advantage over people who want to change those institutions. So I don't want to be a downer, but it really is very difficult to bring about fundamental social change.
Yeah. And then to piggyback off of that, my first research published paper was about social change, and that's basically what we found. It is incredibly hard to get people to stop justifying the status quo, because when you say there's something in your society that needs to change, you look around and you evaluate the system and you say, oh, this is kind of crappy, right? and it makes you feel bad. And people don't like to feel bad, right? We want to be happy when we want to feel good. So it's a lot easier to just justify it, right? You try to rationalize it and make sense of it and say, I'll make do, but what happens is the problem remains, and oftentimes the problem can just loom larger and get bigger and sometimes erupt into these incidents that we see in Ferguson, yeah.
But things do change, right? We have seen progress within
happen.
my lifetime, within other people's lifetimes. But it is a constant struggle that doesn't end in just 2 weeks or a month. It takes years of sort of focused pressure on reform.
I think a very powerful force in the way we deal with these issues has to do with the idea of us versus them. For instance, when we cover some criminal action that happens, or when someone gets murdered, we try to, I guess, imagine some kind of innocence that we can put upon ourselves. Like, for instance, if we see an incident happen, there may be, say, a white person who says, okay, I'm all right, I'm not black, I'm not poor. A black person may look at that same incident and say, okay, I'm black like him, but I'm not poor. You know what I mean? So we try to, I don't know, attach some kind of innocence to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's something that goes across the board, happens with a lot of different, like racism, homophobia, classism, all those issues.
Are you a psychology major by any chance?
No.
Oh, because that's called a defensive attribution. And so we do that to protect ourselves, right? So I always ask my students, what's the common stereotype about homeless people? You know, and they hesitate and then they say, oh, they're lazy, right? When in reality, like the average age of a homeless person is like 9, okay? If you convince yourself that the reason someone is homeless is because they're lazy, then you can just say, well, as long as I'm not lazy, I'll never be that person. As long as I'm not poor, that'll never happen to me. As long as I never challenge the police, I won't be in that person's situation. So it goes all back to just trying to protect our sense of self, kind of trying to make us feel innocent so we know those things won't happen.
I'm too short, I'm sorry. Oh, Jesus. All right, so I have a couple points to make about a couple things that Mr. Jim said and a couple points that Mr. Robert said, and actually something that this young man over here said about what do we want to take from this when we leave, and shall we direct our attention towards the militarized police, or shall we direct it towards the speculative and looting, towards the riots that occurred, and what do we want to get from that? And I kind of just want to piggyback off of both of those things, as she's been doing, about the focus, because it seems like we can sit here and argue that, yes, the police has way too much force in this. They should not be carrying around the type of artillery and weapons that they do. And some of the trucks that they have, yes, they need to feel safe, but I think that they have a little too much, and especially when it's not even portrayed as well as it is towards the looters, it's still quite ridiculous. And I also believe that the rioters are also in the wrong at some point. It does, protesting does become wrong at a point when it becomes violent. And it seems like the main problem here is what's rooted in us and what we're being fed. I mean, we can argue about that all day, but you're eventually going to believe what you're told over and over and over again. I mean, if someone tells you your name is Tyler, they keep telling you that, you're eventually going to believe it no matter what. And I mean, I found a startling statistic I turned on Fox News. Me and my girlfriend were watching it one night, and she's a political science major, so she wanted to get in. We watched that, and we watched the statement by President Obama, which was also extremely disappointing. And there was a statistic by a lady, I don't know what her specialty was or why she was there or how she was able to get there, but she made a statistic, and she said, she came out, and this was the quote. She said, even though Ferguson is 68% African American, I don't even think she said African American, I think she just said black, it's not as ghetto as you think it is. That was the quote. And that was on national television. And I mean, that doesn't even directly affect me, and that pissed me off. I mean, that doesn't directly affect me. I'm not of African American descent, I'm Caucasian, but that still is extremely disheartening. The fact that, and she didn't even mean it in a way that was, you know, she wasn't trying to diss anybody, but the way that she said that, it was almost like it was, and nobody reacted to it, it was almost like, all right, you know, okay, that's the way we talk about things. And the fact that that can be portrayed on national news, I mean, everybody here has watched Fox News before. I mean, they will constantly keep telling us these things and feeding us information that is going to deter us from the main problem. So I think it's a good question to ask both the law professor and the historian whether this is something that is rooted into us. I mean, you can't go through Common Core curriculum without knowing what slavery is. It's impossible. We know what it is, and that's something that we know in the back of our mind. It was something that happened, and then the civil rights never fully allowed African Americans to be as equal as white men were. And is that the problem, or is it that the fact that media just keeps those stereotypes in the back of their head forever? I mean, there's no way you can watch it without a media being slightly.
I have a question kind of rooted around what you're asking as well, is that I think that you made a really interesting statement when you said that has nothing to do with me. When she said that it's not as ghetto as you think, it does have something to do with you,
that's
right?
Right.
And so how do we get to the point where it's okay to say this does have something to do with me?
That was the revelation there, was that doesn't as my skin color doesn't directly affect me, but it did affect me. That was the point made.
Because I think that there is an I'll just say it, and I've got tenure, they can't make me leave, that I don't think that you all are going to cheer after I say this. I think that there is white privilege that I don't think we talk about enough on this campus. I
agree.
How do we at Elon begin that conversation without alienating 85% of our students?
I talk about white privilege in every class that I teach.
How do you do it?
So, if you take a class from Dr. Johnson, we're gonna talk about white privilege. First of all, I don't only talk about white privilege, I talk about privilege in a lot of different contexts, because we all have privileges tied to us in some way, whether we believe it or not, okay? So if you're right-handed, you live in a right-handed world, right? So you know if you're left-handed, you're at a disadvantage. But we understand that there are some privileges that obviously have more serious consequences tied to them. It's hard to get students to acknowledge it, but I think the first step is acknowledging it's there. Okay? So I always say a fish can't see the water in which it swims, right? You don't have to think about how your skin color influences your life, because oftentimes it helps you in ways that it may not help others. Okay? But I think at the same time you have to recognize that just because you acknowledge there are ways in which you may benefit from your skin color, or I like to say, if you're a guy, you benefit from having a penis, right? 77 cents for that dollar isn't fair either. Doesn't necessarily mean that, even though it can be threatening, it doesn't change the fact that it's still there, right? So it's obvious it's not easy to have this kind of discussion. I have students draft lists of ways in which they benefit from being, what ways in which males benefit from being male. You benefit from being Christian in the United States, being right-handed. It's hard to think about all of these things, but I guess the first starting point, if nothing else in class, is to get them to think about it. Yeah. Because I think a lot of students never realize that the opportunities that they have, something as simple as growing up in a two-parent household, growing up with a computer, having parents that went to college, for God's sake, they never realize how those type of things can make their lives easier. And suddenly it just kind of hits them, So.
I teach a critical race theory course, and we begin with white privilege. And I see one of my students, former students, who got this lesson. It's real easy in a legal context because they understand the concept of getting a job and keeping a job. And what I have them read the first week is a study done by a professor trying to explain why there is higher attrition for black associates at law firms. They usually don't stick around to make partner, and there were all of these theories posited. Well, they have lower LSAT scores, they're lower GPAs, and the answer was no, it's really about privilege. It's about privilege and things that we don't think about. So here's how it works. When people are doling out work at a law firm, they do it on the basis of who they like and who they feel like they have something in common with. So if you are, there's male privilege, there's racial privilege. If I'm a male and I like to go see the Charlotte Bobcats and a partner wants to go to see the Charlotte Bobcats, we have a great time. He says, I got this really important project I want you to work on. You get the work. The woman who isn't interested in the Charlotte Bobcats misses out on that opportunity. That works in terms of race too. If I don't golf, if I don't like to sail, if I don't know about Vivaldi, if I don't like the opera, I miss out on opportunities to network, and enjoy the privileges that some of my white colleagues might. So I'm not able to develop those relationships, and it really hits home for the students because they realize, oh, crap.
Oh, just say it.
Right? This is going to affect my job prospects. So it changes the way they view their education, what they're doing in class. They start becoming more well-rounded. This will benefit them. So they try to shake off some of that, some of the disadvantages of their backgrounds. But yeah, privilege is everywhere, and we have to start looking at it.
No question.
So, looking, I guess I'm turning it to a different subject now. Looking at Ferguson, and many of the images we have seen from it have been of police in body armor and modified assault rifles. And to be honest, we're not seeing this just in Ferguson. We've been seeing it growing over the past few years in tiny little towns in the Northeast, the South, the East, West, everywhere. And there's special Pentagon programs and defense programs to increase funding of police departments. And maybe I can turn this to the heads of the police departments here as well. Not putting you on the spot, I swear, but first off, why is there just this rampant militarization of our nation's police force when I do agree that their sole purpose should be to protect and to assist the communities that they serve? But just why is there just this, the rampant militarization, and why in cases of Ferguson do they tend to kind of do the wrong thing at the wrong time?
If the police officers in the room would like to maybe address the issue of the militarization. Hi, Dennis.
Those programs, they're valuable. A lot of departments are underfunded, and they can get good equipment to utilize to serve their purpose. Now, does a 15-man police department need a helicopter? Probably not. But I can speak from. We don't belong to that program. The University Police Department doesn't. But the department I came from, we got a lot of good equipment from them. We got thermal imagers, which we used when we had missing children in wooded areas. We could use those out there. When we were, night vision, similar types of equipment like that.
So no tanks on Williamson, is what you're saying?
I would turn that over to Cliff. There is value to that program. But again, not every department needs an armored personnel carrier or a helicopter. But like I said, there is some value to that program.
Thank you.
Hello. Oh. Hi, I'm from St. Louis, and I don't live in Ferguson. Are you from Ferguson? Right. I live about 20 minutes away in a neighborhood. It's a predominantly white community. And at the time of the incident, it seemed like I was in shock, and I was talking every day about it with my black friends, but then with my white friends, it seemed like life went on, like it was two completely different cities. And so I think that's an example of the white privilege we were talking about before. But I wanted to ask you guys, because I found myself getting frustrated since they weren't saying anything, it seemed like they didn't care. But I found out it's unfair for me to assume that none of them cared. Maybe some of them did, but they were kind of afraid to ask me about it. Since it was so racially charged, maybe they were afraid to say anything. So I wanted to ask you guys, what do you suggest me saying to my white friends if I wanted to initiate a one-on-one conversation? It's easier to do it in a classroom setting, but what do I say to someone, it's just me and them? How do they feel about it? Like, do they care? What do you think I should say?
I think it's just like any other relationship. Your friends, you talk about, well, it depends on the degree of the relationship. If you're really close, if you're intimate friends, then you have a comfort that you can kind of bring that up. I think a lot of this hinges on relationships. It's just think about your family members. Think about who you consider. This is my ace, is what we used to say when I was growing up. And you could, you'd have to. It takes, I guess, you have to take a risk to some degree, but if it's your friend, if it's that person that cares about you, you're probably going to be able to have the conversation. But I would suggest to us all of this is risk taking, and we have to somehow get the courage to take that risk and to ask the question. I mean, it's hard. This is hard stuff. Mm-hmm. It's quite complicated. So many layers to it. You know, I was sitting here thinking about a lot of these questions and whether or not this area could be a Ferguson. Sure could. You know, distressed neighborhoods where there's low resources, where people don't feel respected, it could happen in a second. I mean, I was thinking about, I live in Graham, so I live here, and I went to a meeting about whether or not we could get public transportation, and everybody knows about how difficult that's been. And Graham opted out of it, you know? And I listened to people who said how much they could benefit from this. And when people are struck with that day after day after day after day after day, even the most sensible person can snap. Mm-hmm. And so I would just say, you know, we have to sum up the courage to say to our friend, look, what are you thinking about this? I mean, this is some junk. And it's bothering me, and it's probably bothering you too. How can we try to talk about it? Because, listen, you young folk have got to take, you know, the reins. And I appreciate you being here. I really do. I don't want to try to sum up things, but I do appreciate you being here and being a part of this, because it gives me the sense that you certainly want to be a part of the solution, and you can be. I mean, when people lose hope, they don't have anything. Mm-hmm. When they don't have hope, they don't have anything. And one thing that we can do is try to give people hope. We can give people hope. And it doesn't take a lot sometimes. We think it takes a lot, but it doesn't necessarily take all the money in the world to give respect to a person. So
put on your safety goggles
get
and
some
do
courage.
Yeah. There's a last question from the audience.
Oh, that's special.
I know time went fast.
This is kind of a question for all the panelists and the moderator as well. Sorry. But how do you guys feel about sort of like social media having a huge impact on this? I mean, I found out about it through the Don't Shoot movement and all those pictures. And I know you had brought up Scandal and talking about Scandal, and there is, I can't think of any primetime show that has a Latina person at all, and I can hardly think of any African Americans that are on primetime television. Do you think that has an effect, or do you think that could help change anything if we do put more people in the entertainment world and the media world out there like that?
I think the media is extremely powerful. I do think, though, that, you know, I was thinking about the ALS bucket campaign. If you're not donating the money along with pouring the water on your head, it's not making the same impact, right? And so you have to. And I'll just be honest, I didn't dump the water, for obvious reasons, I didn't dump the water. But I gave the money. So I did donate, because I'm not messing this up. Anyway, so it costs a lot of money. So, but I think that you have to put action behind your words. If you're going to tweet about Ferguson, then you need to figure out a way to then have a conversation with someone you know about it as well. So that's my media part.
I mean, there's empirical evidence of TV shows such as Will and Grace or Modern Family actually changing attitudes about gays and lesbians. And so the same thing can happen in any type of group. And so absolutely, being exposed, we can sort of sympathize and understand and relate to those individuals. Some of us live in very homogenous communities, whatever your race is, and we don't always have the type of interaction. And I think the media can, in some cases, I guess, be sort of a substitute. You don't really want to substitute for the real thing, but it can be an important factor.
And the media is our window into society. So.
Yeah, and that's absolutely. But I know the question about where did these stereotypes start, we can't pinpoint the exact moment, but we know where they come from, right? The media shapes the world that we live in, and so to the extent to which we see more positive images of African Americans and Black Americans, more positive images of all persons, this is going to kind of help be that first way of breaking down those barriers. If you're someone who has no contact with people of color and the only thing you know is what you see on TV, well then what type of perception are you going to have? right? And there are people, I've met people, she made a point of telling me that I was the first black person she'd seen in real life, right? Yeah, like, said, don't tell that to anyone else, okay? You know? So what type of perception do you think she had? Of course, she had tons of questions. She wanted to know so much. She's just like, I've never seen one, I've never been around one. And to think if the media, yeah, you know, these are the moments, right, that take courage. If the media is the only piece of information you're getting, okay? So we have to be so much more responsible. And this is why I love being a professor, because all of you guys are gonna grow up and get jobs, and a lot of you are going to be shaping what the media puts out there. And so you need to be conscientious. You need to think about the type of messages that are put out there. Are you representing people in a way that is harming them? You know, are you telling a fair story? And so I love it when I get students who are in communications and journalism, because they really do need to think about these issues. Yeah.
I have a last question, actually, and to sort of sum up, and I'd like for you to answer from your own perspective, from your discipline. If the police officer who shot Mike Brown doesn't go to jail, what does justice look like in this situation? So an easy question to wrap up.
There needs to be a sense, if he doesn't go to jail, that there was a fair trial, that the institutions of the criminal justice system at least worked to some degree. That's a terrible answer. I don't know.
No.
Yeah. I think it's probably the correct answer. I don't think we have enough information to know if he should go to jail. Statistically speaking, he probably won't, even if there was, because most of these cases, the police officer is not tried with any criminal charges. I think, as someone who teaches public policy, that is maybe not as important as policy change. And I think true justice would be some type of systemic change in, it's not going to be national behavior, but at least in the police department's interaction, racial profiling, or use of lethal force, or hiring of more African-American police officers. That I think is what I would hope justice would look like.
Yeah, I don't think that the cop is going, I don't think he's going to go to jail. And I agree in that I'm not sure there's enough evidence. How do you absolutely prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew that he was unarmed? We really can't, right? We didn't have a camera, there was no one there. But I think in order for the community to heal, in order for the community to feel there's a sense of justice, there does need to be some serious policy change, you know? So if this person cannot go to jail for what happened, how can you guarantee the residents of Ferguson that something like this won't happen again? Okay, and I think that's what justice really needs to look like. You need to do something that's gonna say, we're gonna put these measures in place to make sure that there are no more Mike Browns.
Yeah. I don't have much to add. I'm as pessimistic as everyone on the panel so far in terms of there's qualified immunities, there's absolute immunities that protect government officials, police officers from prosecution and even civil liability in these kinds of cases, so it's very unlikely there will be an official sanction of this officer. But I do think there's some real work that can be done on a policy level. We can demilitarize the police. We can take away all their toys in terms of what's creating this threatening environment. We can go back to a community policing model where we can actually trust the police and they know us and they don't, at the first sign of any trouble, pull out their guns and shoot us. Maybe they know us from having a conversation and they, actually have a conversation with us and figure out what's going on before they shoot us. So I think this is an opportunity to get some policy change. I'm not sure it's going to give us the justice that people are seeking.
Yeah, I just said keep hope alive, right? And I believe the same. I don't know that he will be found guilty, but I think justice looks like giving support to this community in all kinds of ways, educational, jobs, why aren't people voting? What's going on? But being able to support those people who live there, talking to them, what do they think they need to strengthen their communities?
I just want to thank the panelists and thank you all for such a vibrant conversation.
Great. Go ahead.
Thanks to all the participants of tonight's very meaningful program. Again, it shows a lot that you're interested in this program by taking out time at the beginning of the semester, busy start of the semester, to caucus and to hear perspectives, share perspectives about this very important topic. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Husser for his work in collaborating with the Multicultural Center and getting this event put on. We put this together in about 72 hours, with lots of email communication, and so great job, Dr. Husser. This discussion will continue in the newly renovated Multicultural Center immediately following the dismissal of this program. There will be a coffee klatch there, and the refreshments will be provided. So if you feel moved to continue this conversation, and I hope that you do, please consider the Multicultural Center after this. I also want to announce that the Truett Center for Religious and Spiritual Life and the Multicultural Center will co-sponsor a prayer and worship for racial reconciliation event with students from Gospel Choir, InterVarsity, One in Christ, Leaf, and others on next Wednesday, September the 3rd at 7 p.m. All are invited. Students, we want to remind you that there are several campus resources for you as you grapple with some of these tough issues, not just the issues and the topics we discussed tonight, but any issues that are in your way of flourishing. Be mindful of the services in the Counseling Services Center. We also have the Truett Center is available to work with you through managing your identities as you encounter these tough topics, and as well as the Multicultural Center. There's a staff available to assist you in working with you getting through these types of tough things. Now, I'm going to take this moment of privilege that I have here at the microphone and close us out tonight with a personal reflection. In 1990, I turned 16 years old, and along with several of my African-American friends, we were really excited about the privilege of being able to drive a vehicle. And so we were sharing our excitement and enthusiasm for this, and the uncle of one of my friends came out and said, "Listen, guys, I want to talk to you for a very serious moment here. It's like, if you're ever pulled over by a police officer, find the safest route to get to the side of the street, turn the ignition off, and throw up your hands. Put them in clear sight." He said, because there are a number of police officers who are highly prone to shooting black males. And for me, that was the coldest splash of water in the face in regard to racism. But it was even worse for me because this moment was made even more profound because this uncle was an active member of a police force. And he was well aware of how some of his colleagues performed their roles. So just tonight, this topic itself has probably touched you in some form, some fashion, just as I have shared with you as I reflected on the incidents as well. And I hope that you will continue to have the conversations and have found a foundation of information by our expert panelists that will help you deal with this and cope in healthy ways going forward. So again, I thank you all for coming out. If you would like to continue this conversation, please join us on the second floor of Mosley in the Multicultural Center. Good night.